I grew up in a subdivision that bordered directly onto a massive tract of forest. The houses lined one side of Maple Street, and behind them stretched nothing but dense trees for what seemed like forever. When I was younger, a group of neighborhood kids would gather almost every weekend to play together. During the summer months, we'd stay outside until well past dark, only heading in when our parents shouted from back porches that it was time for bed. One of our absolute favorite games was hide and seek during daylight hours. We'd play in the yards and along the edge of the woods. But at night, the game transformed completely. The forest swallowed up all ambient light, and the trees created a disorienting maze where everything looked identical no matter which direction you faced. That's what made it frightening, and that's exactly what made it exciting. The last time I ever played hide and seek in those woods, I was 15 years old. It was mid-July, unbearably hot and humid even after the sun went down. There were 6 of us that evening. Me, my best friend Derek, his younger brother Nathan, and 3 kids from further down the street, Brandon, Sean, and Tommy. We'd been shooting baskets in Derek's driveway for most of the evening, but eventually, we all got tired and sprawled out on the grass, drinking from water bottles and trying to cool down. Someone suggested we play outside because it had to be cooler than sitting in anyone's stuffy basement. The rules we established were simple. You could hide anywhere in the backyards or within the woods. But you had to remain close enough to hear when the seeker announced the round was over. Brandon volunteered to be it first. The rest of us scattered as he started counting. I ran into the woods with Derek, but we split up once we'd passed the first line of trees. I found a good spot behind a massive fallen oak tree and crouched down low, my heart pounding with anticipation despite it being just a game. I could hear Brandon's voice calling out numbers back in the yard, the sound echoing slightly through the trees. When he finished counting, everything went silent except for the constant chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. I stayed motionless, controlling my breathing. After a while, I heard footsteps crunching through the dried leaves and undergrowth. They were moving between the trees, slowly but deliberately. I assumed it was Brandon searching for us. I held my breath and remained completely still, waiting for him to pass by my hiding spot. The footsteps stopped somewhere close to me, close enough that I could almost feel the presence of whoever it was. They just stood there, not moving, not calling out. I waited for them to continue searching or to shout that they'd found my hiding spot, but they didn't do either. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. I almost whispered to ask who it was, but then I remembered that talking would give away my position and I'd lose the round. Sir. I stayed silent and still. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, moving deeper into the woods, away from the yards. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. I peeked over the fallen log, but the darkness was too complete to see very far. The moonlight only penetrated to the tops of the trees, leaving the ground level in deep shadow. I stayed in my hiding spot for several more minutes before growing tired of waiting. I carefully crawled out and started making my way back toward the yards, stepping quietly. As I emerged from the tree line, I heard Brandon shouting that the round was over and everyone should come out. I walked back to find the others already gathered in Derek's backyard. Brandon had found Derek and Sean, but not me or Nathan. Nathan came jogging out of the woods a minute later, his clothes covered in dirt and leaves. He laughed triumphantly, saying nobody would have ever found his spot. I mentioned that I'd been behind the fallen oak and that I'd almost been caught when Brandon walked right past me. But Brandon looked genuinely confused. He said he'd never gone that deep into the woods. He said he'd only circled around the first few rows of trees before finding Derek crouched near the fence line. I asked who had walked past my hiding spot then, but everyone just shrugged. Nobody had an answer. We all brushed it off as a misunderstanding and decided to keep playing. The next round, I was chosen to be the seeker. I counted loudly with my face pressed against a tree trunk while the others scattered in different directions. When I finished counting, I began searching the yards first, quickly finding Sean hiding behind Derek's father's tool shed and Tommy wedged into some bushes near the back fence. Then I ventured into the woods to look for Brandon and Nathan. The forest was quieter now. Even the crickets seemed to have fallen silent. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, swinging between tree trunks as I walked slowly forward. I listened carefully for any movement or heavy breathing. After a while, I spotted Nathan crouched near a large tree trunk. I called out that I'd found him, and he jumped up laughing before running back toward the yard. That left only Brandon. I continued deeper into the woods, calling out warnings that I was getting closer. That's when I heard them again, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps moving through the undergrowth ahead of me. They came from just beyond my flashlight's range. I aimed the beam in that direction, but the trees were too dense to see clearly. I moved forward cautiously, trying not to make much noise myself. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I stopped too, waiting and listening. My nerves were starting to fray. Then I heard Brandon's voice behind me, calling that the round was over. I spun around to see him already walking back toward the yard through the trees. Confused, I asked if he'd just been ahead of me in the woods. He said no, he'd been hiding much closer to the houses the entire time, wedged between someone's shed and fence. Car. I felt my stomach twist with unease. For the second time that night, I had heard someone moving through the woods who wasn't one of us. I tried to convince myself it was probably just an animula deer, maybe, or a large dog that had gotten loose from someone's yard. But the footsteps had sounded distinctly human, too heavy and rhythmic to be anything else. We played several more rounds. Each time I hid in the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. Kai kept hearing faint sounds, branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot, movements in the darkness just beyond the range of our flashlights. At one point, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move between the trees, tall and distinct from the natural shadows. But when I aimed my flashlight, there was nothing there. The others didn't seem to notice anything unusual. They just kept laughing and running and playing. I tried to act normal, but the nervous feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. The final round of the night, Brandon wanted to hide deep in the woods again. We all spread out like before. I didn't want to go far from the yards, so I stayed near the edge where I could still see the porch lights through the trees. I crouched low in some tall grass and weeds. I could hear Brandon's distant voice counting. When he finished, silence fell over everything. After a few minutes passed, I heard something that made every muscle in my body lock up with fear. Kit. It was whispering, a low, raspy voice, too quiet to make out actual words, but definitely human, and it was close. My whole body tensed. I very carefully peeked over the grass, but I couldn't see anyone in the immediate darkness around me. I strained to listen, but the whispering had stopped. A moment later, I heard footsteps again, moving past my position and heading deeper into the woods. I lay there shaking, my heart hammering against my ribs. That's when Brandon called out that the game was over and everyone should come out. The others emerged from their hiding spots, laughing and brushing dirt off their clothes. I walked back slowly, my heart still racing. I told them I'd heard someone whispering in the woods, but they all just laughed and said I was trying to scare them. I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd heard was real. We gathered in Derek's yard afterward, sitting on the grass and drinking sodas while we talked and cooled down. That's when Nathan asked quietly if anyone else had noticed the man in the woods. We all stopped talking and turned to stare at him. He said that while he was hiding during one of the rounds, he'd seen a tall figure standing motionless between the trees, watching us," Keith said. "The man didn't move or make any sound, just stood there observing." Brandon immediately told him he was making it up. Sean laughed nervously and said Nathan was just trying to freak us out. But I felt sick to my stomach because I believed him completely. Everything I'd experienced that night suddenly made horrifying sense. We ended the evening shortly after that. Everyone headed to their respective homes. I lay in bed that night, staring at my ceiling, unable to sleep. I kept hearing the whispering replaying in my mind, kept seeing that shadow moving between the trees, kept feeling the presence of someone watching from the darkness. I never played hide and seek in those woods again. Even now, years later, whenever I hear leaves crunching in the dark or catch movement in my peripheral vision at night, I think back to that evening. I think about the man Nathan said he saw standing motionless in the shadows. I think about the footsteps that followed us, the whispering I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just a homeless person passing through the area, Kumama. Maybe it was someone who actually lived somewhere deep in those woods. All I know for certain is that when you hide in dark forests at night, you can never really be sure who else is hiding there with you.